Good morning. Let's move into talking about evolution and making sure we understand evolution and the problems with evolution. And then later this week, we will look at some of the experiments and other types of proofs that they use to try to prove evolution, and we will kind of look at those things critically. Let me begin with a passage of scripture that I don't want you to take the wrong way, but it's going to sound like I'm being antagonistic toward those who would believe in evolution, and I don't mean this verse at all in that way. Let me read it, and then I want to give a brief explanation. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 3, starting in verse 18, which says, "Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks he is wise in this age, let him become a fool, so that he can become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, since it is written, He catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows that the reasonings of the wise are futile. Let no one boast in human leaders, for everything is yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come. Everything is yours, and you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God." Particularly in that passage, I like that statement in verse 18, let him become a fool so that he can become wise. There's a lot of people in our world who have come up with theories and ideas and explanations for how things can be the way they are, and they do that based on the wisdom of men, and they hold on to those ideas, even though there's little to no evidence for those ideas, instead of appearing like a fool in the eyes of the world. And what Paul says here is, no, just go ahead and give in to the idea that the world will find you foolish so that you can truly be wise, so that you can truly have understanding that only comes from God. And that really is a worldview issue, as we've talked so many times in this series so far. And you're going to find that evolution is also a worldview issue as we try to understand it. Just the brief overview of evolution, let me throw a couple of principles out to you. It's based off of three main ideas. One is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That is the idea that we pass down our characteristics to the next generation. Now, originally, when this idea was put together and popularized, it was the idea that if I were to cut off my left arm in an accident, that my next child would, even if they were born with an arm, their arm would be weakened. And so they inherited my acquired characteristics. And that was based off of the idea of if I struggle with let's say a stomach sickness, the next generation might also struggle with that stomach sickness. And that is a true concept. We know now that that's based off of maybe a predisposition in your genetics, or maybe it could even be that my sickness has passed down and become the sickness of my children. But they would take it from a much more physical standpoint, like we talked about with the cutting off of arms. Obviously, that second understanding is not an accurate understanding. The next principle of evolution is adaptation. Adaptation is the idea that a creature will adapt to their surrounding, to their environment, and as they adapt, those new acquired characteristics are going to be passed down, which goes back to the first principle. And again, there's a lot of truth in adaptation. We do tend to adapt to our environment. We do tend to even adapt certain characteristics that can even be passed down. This explains, in a lot of ways, the differing skin tones, melatonin levels, and different what we call races. But the truth is, there really isn't a race issue, a physical race in our country, in our genetics. What we have is we are humans, and then we've just acquired different characteristics through generation after generation. So that adaptation and the acquired characteristics are a true concept when you deal with any creature, really. Part of that, though, is not necessarily adaptation where we have changed to adapt to our environment, but that we have found environments that adapt to our changes. And we're going to see this as we get into talking about Darwin's finches, how the different birds had different sized beaks, which allowed them to survive best in different environments. And so birds with longer beaks tended to go to the parts of the beach where they could dig to find their food, and birds with stronger, shorter beaks stayed in the parts of the beaches where there were nuts that they could eat and crack open with those beaks. And so it was not just an adaptation of the animal to the environment, but it was a adaptation of the environment to the animal, honestly. And so the animal went where the environment best suited them. That also leads us into natural selection, which is the idea that in a particular environment, the animal that is best suited for that environment is the one that will survive. And so you're going to have a dying out of the animals with the characteristics that aren't great for that environment, and you're going to have a strengthening of the animals that have the characteristics that do survive best in that particular environment. Now, microevolution, some of the instances that we've cited thus far, like Darwin's finches, is absolutely true. We can watch it, we can see it happen, we can particularly see it happen when it comes to bacteria these days, because we can watch them reproduce generation after generation very quickly because of their life cycle. And so we can see the changes that happen in those bacteria as they adapt to different medicines and they adapt to different antibiotics. There's a lot of microevolution that we can watch. The problem is macroevolution, which is just called evolution by most. It's a theory. It's a theory where basically you take these three main ideas of evolution. You give them enough time, you watch that adaptation happen generation after generation. Well, if you've got 5 generations, you're going to have a small change. What if we had 5,000 generations? We'll multiply that small change by 1,000 changes, and you might have a significant change. And so it is based off of the theory that if we will allow enough time, those small changes, microevolution, can become large-scale changes, which is macroevolution. And macroevolution includes the idea that species turned into other species, and animals turned into other animals, and that you can create an evolutionary trail or tree that reaches back to us all having a common ancestor. The other problem with macroevolution, besides the fact that we just really can't actually see it happen because it needs so much time to happen, is that it is based off of a consistent rate of change. The only way for me to count backwards is for my counting to work the same in the past as it works in the present. The only way for me to add those small changes together through history working backwards is for history to have worked the same way in the past that it works today. And we know that's not true. We know that there is not a consistent rate of change, that the world has not always functioned the same. You'll have scientists talk about an ice age. Well, the ice age would have absolutely dramatically affected what they need in order to try to prove evolution. We as Christians believe in the flood. That would have changed things significantly. And so you look at all of that and you realize not only is there not enough time to really try to prove the concept of evolution, and there's not a way to observe what has happened over a long enough span of time. But you also don't have a consistency in history that allows us to truly try to talk about and prove evolution. The other problem with evolution is that if we had enough time and we had consistency, then we should be able to look at the evidence that has been left by creatures in order to try to see if there really was a consistent rate of change. And the best way to do that is to look at the fossil record. Well, look at these quotes that I want to read to you about the fossil record particularly. David M. Roth, who works at the Field Museum of Natural History, said Darwin was embarrassed by the fossil record because it didn't look the way he predicted it would. Well, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. We have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. You might wonder, how do we have fewer? Well, because we have looked at some of the evolutionary transitions that supposedly exist in Darwin's time, and we figured out they weren't actually evolutionary transitions. And so we don't have the fossil record to back up the theory. One of the most famous proponents of the theory of evolution was the late Harvard paleontologist Stephen Gould, but Gould admitted the following: the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbook have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history, yet to preserve our favorite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study. Senior paleontologist of the British Museum put it this way: gradualism is a concept I believe in, not just because of Darwin's authority, but because my understanding of genetics seems to demand it. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say that there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. I mean, you look at those kind of quotes and you realize the fossil record doesn't prove the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin admitted that his theory required the existence of transitional forms, yet Charles Darwin wrote, "So the number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. But assuredly, if this theory be true, such had lived on the earth." Well, we're not finding that fossil record. Darwin also wrote, "Why then is not every geological formation and every strata full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against my theory." Darwin thought that the lack of transitional links in his time was because only a small portion of the surface of the earth has been geologically explored and no part with sufficient care. Well, now that we're almost 200 years later than Darwin, we have explored the earth's crust geologically. We have dug deeply to find these transitional forms, and we haven't found them. The record's not there. Charles Darwin grew older, and he became increasingly concerned about the lack of evidence for the theory of evolution. So he wrote, "When we descend to details, we cannot prove that a single species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory." Because of the lack of fossil records, there are scientists who are now starting to question whether Darwin's theory is really a valid theory for scientists to be touting as the basis for our understanding of our existence. And one of those scientists is a guy named Michael Behe, who wrote this book, pictured on the screen, and I encourage you to read this book. It's an excellent book. He does a good job of in every chapter, before he gets into the technical section, he'll mark it, and he says if you don't want to get into the technical section, just skip over this section. He'll mark the beginning and end of it and give a summary of it that's easy to understand. So for those of you who are less smart as I am, you can skip over some of those more difficult sections, or if you really want to challenge yourself, you can dig into them deeply. But he proposed in Darwin's Black Box that there was a lot that Darwin couldn't see. During Darwin's day, if you looked through a microscope, all you could see was the outline of a cell, of a plant cell, but you couldn't see the inside of the cell. You couldn't see all of the complications that went on the inside. And so there was a lot of information that we have now that Darwin didn't have. So his theory, while it could have been very valid during his day with a lack of information, the more we learn, the more we're realizing his theory doesn't actually work. Not only is there not records in the geological world, there's no transitional fossil records, but you also don't even have a genetic proof of this. You don't have any cellular level proof of evolution. There's really not proof of evolution in any direction you look in. For instance, one of the things that Behe brings up is that the process of proteins and DNA, protein is what makes DNA work. DNA is merely a series, a code, and all it is information. DNA in and of itself does not do anything. What makes DNA work is proteins come along and they do the process of duplicating or transcribing and translating the DNA and moving the DNA where it needs to be and recopying the DNA and causing the DNA to function. Well, do you know what the code of DNA is? It is the code for proteins. The problem with this is DNA could not have existed without proteins, and proteins really have no function without DNA. So you have a chicken and an egg situation. Which came first? Both are necessary in order for DNA to have any function whatsoever, or for protein to have a function. And because of that, what you have, they're both irreducibly complex. They are both incredibly complicated codes and processes, and how do you have one without the other? You could not have had those develop slowly by small steps over the course of millions of years. They would have had to develop in their complicated form together at the same time, functioning together. The coelom and the flagellum. Here's a picture of a flagellum over here on the screen. And the flagellum is in a bacteria, in a one-celled organism. You've got this little tail that functions as a more or less a propeller. It's a way that causes the bacteria or the one-celled organism to move around. Well, the problem with that is, as we've looked deeply and at the complex structure of the flagellum, there's no way to make the flagellum function if it developed in small stages. It would have had to develop as its complicated self. Well, Darwin couldn't have known that. He couldn't see the flagellum. He had no idea that a flagellum existed. He had no idea of the complexity that exists even in something as simple as a simple one-celled organism. But there's such great complications and complexity that come in these particular creatures. The eyeball's the same way, and even Darwin admitted this in his books, that the eyeball posed a problem for him because he could not figure out how it could have developed over time, over a series of evolutionary steps. Well, the eyeball can't, if there's anything that doesn't function correctly in the eyeball, the whole eyeball becomes useless. And as you can see here in this very simplified diagram of the eyeball, there's a lot of pieces to our human eyeball. And even if you go to a simpler organism than we humans, their eyeballs are incredibly complex. Even some animals that can really only see the difference between light and dark, as far as we can tell. Their eyeballs are extremely complex. And that makes it very hard to figure out how that would have developed over evolutionary stages. There's blood clotting. You look at this process for blood clotting, there's a lot of factors involved in blood clotting. You've got proteins involved, you've got vitamins that allow the body to create the proteins, you've got the DNA that is necessary to create the protein in order to bring the cells in place that cause the blood clotting to work. This simplified diagram is still incredibly complex. Well, which one of these steps are you going to throw out in order to make a process simpler, in order to make it, get from simple to complex over the course of evolutionary stages? You can't. It is irreducibly complex. You cannot reduce its complexity and still have a working system. So you look at these kind of systems, and this is just a few of thousands of things that just, there's no explanation as to how it could have happened in evolutionary stages. It really doesn't make any sense in that manner. And so what you end up really dealing with is not a science versus faith concept when it comes to evolution, but you have a faith in evolution. Evolution, the theory of evolution, the macroevolution concept, is merely one explanation for what evidence exists and how it exists and how it came to be. And the problem with it is there's a lot of manipulation and deception of the evidence to make it match the theory. You're going to see that in Wednesday's lesson. I'm going to dig into some of those manipulations and experiments that were used to try to prove evolution and how they were used to falsify, honestly, the conclusions. There's really no empirical, objective evidence that consistently proves the theory of evolution. It is merely, we have proof for microevolution. And we can theorize that if we take enough microevolution and add it all together, that we can come up with macroevolution. But that's merely a theory. And we need to be cautious about that. The people who tout that macroevolution is fact, that it's absolutely true, they believe that, but they cannot prove that. It takes faith to believe whichever direction you go. If you want to believe in God, it takes faith. There's no objective proof of God. You can look at evidence in the world and see that it's reasonable to believe in God. You can examine the evidence, but you can't run an experiment to prove God. You must examine the evidence, make a decision based on the evidence, and whenever new evidence shows up, you need to consider it in order to make sure that what you're believing is true. But you have to leave the door open to the concept, to the idea, to the fact that believing in God requires faith. It requires you to make that decision as a part of your worldview development. The same is true with evolution. There's evidence that is used to try to say that this proves evolution, but it doesn't. And so what you do is you make a decision, the best decision you can based on the evidence. And when you get new evidence, you must re-examine your belief. You must re-examine whether what you believe is true or not. And that, you should always leave open the door to the concept that maybe there's an explanation that you've not considered. I, because of the evidence, believe there is a God. I, because of the evidence, believe the Bible comes from God. And we've already talked about those in previous lesson. I believe the evidence is not only sufficient, but it is overwhelming to allow me to believe in God. But I must also consider the fact that there are many people who believe the evidence is overwhelming for macroevolution. And part of the reason they believe that is because of all of the misinformation or the experiments and such that have been run that have been said to prove evolution, which really don't when you dig into them deeper, which is what we will do on Wednesday.